Hey, my name's Brent. Welcome back to the TMAX 500 service series on 49cc Scoop. Today I'm going to be doing a full inspection and full service of the TMAX's CVT. I want to check out the CVT because I want to make sure there's no damage to the drive faces, like any grooves worn into them, etc., or anything else that could be a problem going on there. I also already have a brand new CVT drive belt. I bought that before my 12,000 mile service because I'm so used to the small scooters that I was sure with 12,000 miles I needed a new drive belt, and it turned out that it was barely worn. So I'm going to replace that this time unless there's essentially no wear on the belt, which I wouldn't expect at nearly 28,000 miles. The last time around at 12,000 miles, I just used compressed air and blew all the debris out of this filter. But this time I've got a replacement for it, as well as the filter that's on the other side of the scooter for the CVT. The service manual tells you to remove the muffler. They also tell you to remove the fuel tank. I've never had any need to remove the fuel tank. For the muffler, I just removed this cover here. The corner of the CVT cover has to kind of squeeze by one of the pipes down here. And I can see where it would be easier without the exhaust on there, and you take less risk of skidding something up. But I have never removed the exhaust in order to get the CVT cover off. I'm getting ready to remove the Variator and the torque driver, or as they call it, the primary and secondary sheaves. This is one of those places where you're going to need a specialty tool unless you just want to use an impact on these, which I think it's a good idea, at least when you put them back, to go ahead and torque them to spec. So this is what I have. This is not made by Molosi, as the sticker said. That's just something I put on there. This is a chunk of, I believe it's 1/4 inch or 3/16 flat bar to make the handle, and this is a giant washer. And then I've just got bolts and washers and nuts going through there to serve their purposes, because on the Variator there are 4 holes in here. So on one side there are 4 bolts sticking out that align with those holes to allow you to hold it. And then on the torque driver there's a hole here and a hole here, and because of the way it's turned I can't get it to align really, but the bolts on the other side are going to go into there to hold that in place while you remove or install the nuts on those. And this idea is not my own. I got the idea for this from Big Wheels Turning. He actually had plans of it online, told exactly what size washer, so if I can still find those I will try to put those up here. And you can also buy this from Yamaha, but I believe it's pretty expensive, which is why people tend to make their own. Before I remove anything, I want to remind you that if you're like me and you're doing this in the middle of a service and you happen to have the engine apart like I do, where you've got the camshaft or camshafts out because of a valve adjustment or something, Just be aware that when you turn this, this is your crankshaft, so you will be throwing all of that out of spec, and you'll have to go back later and make sure everything's aligned. I'm going to turn this a little bit so I can actually get this in here how I want it. If whatever you make is long enough, you don't even really have to hold this other than just putting pressure on it to hold it inward, and you can kind of rest it against the ground this way when you're loosening. I'm going to do this the easy way for removal and just use an impact. While I've got the impact right here, I'm going to remove this one as well. Pretty much the same deal. You may need to rotate this to get it wherever you need for it to fit. Again, this time you're flipping over to the 2 bolts to line up with this pulley. Get that straight in there. In this case, the exhaust is in the way. I can't really get this thing to hold itself for loosening, so I will have to hold the handle while I use my impact. I'm going to clean this shaft off a little bit and the threads there. I'm just using a little bit of alcohol, and I'm also going to wipe right around here on the intersection of this pulley. But then I'm going to make alignment marks. I'm going to put one right here on the shaft, and one here onto the pulley. I can use those later when everything's reinstalled to put this back the same way that it came off. While I'm in here and the pulleys are out, I do want to clean this area up. There's actually not a whole lot of dust or anything in here, but it's just good practice. And before I do that, I just wanted to look over the seals and make sure there's no oil dripping or anything that would tell me I've got a bad seal. I should also mention I'm just leaving the gasket in place because it's kind of stuck on there. I don't plan to replace it. It looks like it's in decent shape, so I'm just going to leave that alone. And also, you'll want to make sure you have these little pins in here. Make sure that they don't get lost during the process. There's a passage right in the top of this that leads to a hose that leads to another CVT filter. And this thing is pretty nasty, as you can see. I'm going to replace it. For now, what I'm going to do is just remove it, and then I want to blow some compressed air through the hose just to be 100% certain that there's no debris or anything in that hose. Now I'm going to check the drive belt width. .2 roughly, and you want to check in multiple spots. About 31.2, a little over 31. So they say 32 millimeter width as the normal spec, or I guess that's the starting spec, and 30.5 millimeters as the limit. So based on that, this belt is actually still good, and I wrote it down when I checked at 12,000 miles. At 12,000 miles, I got between 31.35 and 31.55 millimeters. So this thing has barely worn in 16,000 miles roughly. So I would really see no need to replace it because I don't see any damage or cracking or anything, which is really impressive to me because I believe this is the stock belt. I don't think anyone ever changed it. So 28,000 miles and the thing's barely worn. But Since I have a brand new V-belt here, I will probably hang on to this thing just in case I need one, which honestly I'd probably buy another anyway, but you never know. I'll hang on to it because it's still a good belt, and I'll just put this one in when it's time to put it back together. Now I want to check out the Variator. Wait a minute, that's not a Variator. This is a Variator. I'll start with the easiest part, and that for me is the sliders. So I'm just going to clean these up first and then I can check them over. Now with the sliders, these are Dr. Pulley sliders. I put 15 and 17 grams in here, so average weight of 16 grams. With a roller, what you'd want to do is take a good look at them and make sure that they are totally round. If you see any flat spots on a roller weight, then you've got a problem and it needs to be replaced. With sliders, I've had really good luck with these so far in everything I've put them in, from 49cc to 495cc like this thing, and it looks like they're still doing very well. I'm not seeing a bunch of wear marks or anything on this one. If they continue that way, then I shouldn't have to do anything with my sliders other than put them back in when it's time. After checking all of the sliders with about 15,000 miles on them, these are the worst wear spots I can find anywhere. And even at that rate, I can't really feel it. It's just, you can see it here, but running my finger over it, I don't even feel that it's rough. So these are definitely fine. Now I'll move over to these guides or bushings, whatever, that are also from Dr. Pulley. Same amount of miles on there. I'm going to pull each one of them off, clean them up, and just make sure they don't have any wear or damage. This is about as bad as it gets for these, and even that, I don't catch any edges, can't really feel it. It's just a marking, so these are fine too. On the ram plate first, you want to make sure there's no damage to any of the splines in there. If there is, it's going to have to be replaced. And then you want to look over everything for cracking or any sort of obvious damage. On the other side, you'll see wear markings from where the rollers or sliders are up against the ramp plate. In this case, this is what you'd like to see, is that you can tell that they've been rubbing against there, but I can't actually feel any edges. It's not actually wearing into the ramp plate or anything like that. So again, on this side, look it over and make sure there's no cracks or damage. Now for the collar, or what I call the drive boss, there seems like there should be a speck of the outside diameter. If there is, I'm missing it. If I find it, I'll put it on the screen, of course. But the easy way to tell if this is worn, really, you can see that there are wear marks basically all the way across this area, and you don't see any wear marks here. If you can't feel any difference between those two, or measure any difference between those two, most likely it's fine. If you get any deep gouges or scratches in there, then you'll want to replace the collar or drive boss. If you look in the center of this, you'll see that there's basically a grease pocket in there. One area in the middle that's a larger diameter than the rest of it, and that is so that it can hold grease or a lubricant when it goes back together. So you got to be really careful to try and get all of the old grease out of there when you clean it up. And just like you check the outside, you can look at the inside diameters to make sure there's no damage there, no scratching, scarring, etc., as well as the ends. The Variator has a seal on each side, and I'm going to replace both of those. I've had this thing apart multiple times and never replaced them before, so you don't actually have to replace them every time as long as you don't pull them out of there. But I believe I have those around. If not, I'll order them, so I'm going to go ahead and replace those now. Or actually, I'm just going to pull them out now and I'll replace them before the Variator is ready to go back in. There it goes. just like the collar or the drive boss. Inside of here, there's another one of those grease pockets, I call them. So you're going to have to make sure you get all of that out of there. There's a whole lot of areas in here to clean. I ended up, once I got the worst of it out, I took it into the kitchen sink and cleaned it with soap and water. So one thing I did want to mention related to that is that I used to use brake parts cleaner for pretty much all of my CVT cleaning, and I stopped that because I started reading about belt manufacturers and how they did not recommend it. It could be detrimental to the belt if any brake parts cleaner gets onto the belt. So now I think soap and water is a good way to finish dish soap and water. Something that leaves no residue. You could wipe them down with alcohol or something like that when you're finished. And I just start with a general purpose degreaser to begin with. So again, go over the whole thing and look for any obvious damage, any cracks, signs of wear, etc. You want to make sure you check each one of the ramps or the paths here inside, and be sure that even though you can see these areas, they're not gouged in there. You can't really feel them on the edges. If you can, you may need to replace your variator. You want to make sure you don't see any gouging, scoring, etc. inside there. And make sure these guides, now I can't think of what you'd call them, are not eaten up, chewed away, which when you looked at the side of them, usually you can see where the travel starts and stops. So if you see where the travel stops and above that, you can actually feel a lip on there or something, or you can see the difference like it's worn away, then you're going to have to replace the variator. On the face, first off, make sure there's no damage in the seal area, no damage on this side of the inside of the variator. And then you want to look over the face very carefully for any damage. You can run your finger across the surface of the dry face and make sure you don't feel any ridges or any imperfections, any wear that way. But what I like to do is take a straight edge. This is actually just a steel ruler. You can buy an actual machinist straight edge if you'd like. You need a nice flat metal surface. And lay that across the dry face. Try to get it to sit flat. Then you can take a flashlight and shine it through from the other side, and as long as you're sitting it flat, anywhere that you see light coming through is probably an imperfection in your drive face, so you may need to replace the variator or whatever face you're looking at. You can do that with all the drive faces in the CVT. The other thing you want to do if you're not using an actual machinist straight edge, or even if you are, is just check the area that you're using for damage. Make sure you don't think you're seeing damage because it's actually your straight edge has something wrong with it. This is something that some people like to do and some people don't like to do. I prefer to go over the drive face with a Scotch-Brite pad like you see here, and I'm not trying to sand it down or anything. I'm just making sure everything's totally clean, and then I'll go over it one more time with my cleaning solutions, just like I explained earlier when I finish this up. Some people like to do it to give the belt something for a little bit of traction. I just like to do it essentially to make sure there's no leftover pieces of the belt when I am putting it all back together. Pretty much like everything else, I went ahead and cleaned up the fixed half of the front pulley, checked it for any damage, and used a straight edge to check for flatness or trueness across it. The only difference here is that you do want to go over all these splines and make sure they're in good condition. If you want to take the rear pulley apart or the secondary sheave, then you're going to need some kind of spring compressor, because this is not like small scooters where you can just sometimes use your hand, or if nothing else, put your feet on. Usually they have a clutch here instead of this plate. You'll put your feet on that and hold it. This has got a lot of tension there. It's not going to be easy to do, and it's going to be dangerous, so you want some kind of spring compressor. I've got a video about how to make a simple one, just using a PVC pipe cap with some cuts, and also some all-thread nuts and washers. I made this one up just out of steel. Same idea though. This one's really easy and it has worked fine for me in the past. Before you use the compressor, you will need to get this nut loose. You don't want to remove it by any means without a compressor on there. You just want to break it loose. So a common method is to take a big adjustable wrench or pipe wrench of some sort and put that on there, get it adjusted to the size of the nut, and then people will take that, kind of hold it against there, smack this onto something hard, and you can break the nut loose that way. The other way, easy way again in my case, is use a 46mm socket, hit it with the impact, but I don't want to hold the impact gun on it. I just want to break that loose. I don't want this to come off. At this point, you should only try to install this so that it is snug. You should feel that the spring moves a little since you've backed the nut off just a tiny bit. And once you take up the slack from that, don't keep going. Just stop there. Because that plate has a stop on it. You're not going to push that plate down. You're just going to bend stuff, or if it's PVC, you could shatter it. So once you've got that snug down, then you can try to get in there and loosen the nut up by hand. Now that the nut is totally off of the threads, I can just remove my compressor, and that will slowly release the spring tension, and then I can disassemble this. Suddenly I remember that I meant to get a longer piece of all thread for this because the same thing happened last time. But if your all thread is long enough, you won't have to worry about that. At least still, by the time the spring is way up there, there's not all the tension. You can imagine how much it would be if you tried to release it and just hold it when it was way down there. But anyway, now spring can come off of there, pull this out. Now I just want to make sure that this moves smoothly. So I'm just going to twist it. You're not going to be able to just pull a torque driver straight up. I'm going to twist it and just make sure I don't feel anything rough in there. It's not extremely hard. I mean, this is a big pulley, so it's going to be a bit difficult. That feels alright to me. I still want to take it apart because I'm going to clean and re-grease everything. This cover here, or cap, should just twist off. Sometimes if they're really stubborn, you can try to get a small screwdriver under there and gently work that up, but you got to be careful not to bend anything if you do that. Now you'll see that there are 4 grooves around here with pins in them, and actually it's hard to see that there are pins in them right now because there's so much grease packed in there. But if I just move this with my screwdriver, pull a little grease out of there, you can see right up here there is a pin in that groove. So I'm just going to get in there with a pair of needle nose pliers and pull that pin out of there carefully. And repeat that process for all of the pins. Now this should just slide straight up and off. Again, you've seen me clean enough CVT stuff already, so I'm going to go ahead and get all the grease and dirt off of this thing, and then I'll get back to you. I've got all of the parts for the rear pulley cleaned up, and everything pretty much looks good, aside from, if you look at this groove in the rear pulley, the torque driver, I'm not sure that it shows up here real well, but there is wear on those grooves or in those grooves, and that leaves some sharp edges here outside of the grooves, right on that edge, right on the corner around the wear. So that's on every one of them, and it's very minor. It doesn't feel really rough there, like a big difference in the transition, but technically if you have wear in here or damage of any sort, Yamaha says to replace the secondary sheaves as a set. So not just the torque driver, but the fixed half as well. My problem with this is when I looked up Yamaha parts, this half, the movable half or the torque driver, is about $150. This half, the fixed half, is over $200. I forget the exact total, but between the two of them, they come out to almost $400 for this rear pulley. I assume that they tell you to replace these two halves together because of the belt wearing against both of these surfaces. They want to make sure that wear is even and the belt doesn't wear oddly, etc. That would be my guess. That, or maybe they just like collecting a whole bunch extra money. Hard to know, but I looked into other options. Malossi does sell a torque driver for this, but when I read the description, it says multiple times for boosted motors. And I know that turbos are very popular overseas for these things, so I'm afraid that they really are just designed for the turbo, and with all the power that they have, it would act totally different on a naturally aspirated, basically stock engine, and it would run awful, or at least be worse than stock, so I wouldn't want to do that. The overrange kit for these, I think, was $600 to $700. I really don't want to put that kind of cash into it. Again, if everything was messed up, then I would probably be more willing to at least consider it, but at this point, I think I'm going to try to work with this. My plan for now is to try and knock all of the sharp edges off of there from the wear, and then just make sure that the paths feel smooth. So I'm not sure if I'm going to end up using files or my rotary tool, sandpaper, exactly which methods are going to work best for this particular setup. But this is something I've done a bunch of times on smaller scooters, and it's worked out fairly well. They tend to last as long as the damage is not really severe. Once I get that done, then I want to assemble it without grease or anything and just make sure there's not a lot of slop in there after I've worked it over a little bit. And I want to be clear that whatever I do, I'm not trying to take a bunch of material off of here. The worst I'm going to try to do is just to smooth out some sort of transition. I don't think I'm going to be able to show this to you while I do it because I've really got to hold this exactly how I need it just to get the right angles. So I'll try to show you now. If you look at this edge here, I'm going to take a carbide burr and a rotary tool, and I'm going to try to just come in at an angle and basically chamfer this edge right here. I'm going to do that everywhere that there's a rough edge or a sharp edge. I'm just trying this stuff out on one groove instead of doing all four at once right now to see how it works. So far, the carbide burr has worked pretty well to get that smoothed out, as well as going over it after that with a little bit of emery cloth to make sure it's totally smooth on the edges, and I did that inside and outside. Now for the actual path itself, the edges of the path, I'm going to try to go over that with a diamond encrusted burr. That should be nice and fine. I don't want to take a bunch of material off. Just anywhere, if I feel any kind of ridge or anything that's not totally smooth, I just basically want to try and sand that down and make a nice smooth transition all the way through there. To finish it off, I want to try to sand in there, so quick tip on that, just take a file if you've got very small files like this flat file, and then you can take sandpaper, wrap it around your file, And that makes it easy to get in there and sand the grooves. There's what it looks like after finishing up with sandpaper. I also took a little bit of polish and put on a paper towel and just rubbed through there to smooth it out a little better. And it also helps you see any kind of imperfections when it's a little bit shinier. But I don't feel anything that it's hanging up on, and it looks fairly smooth to me. Now I want to see how this feels when it is installed on here. I want to make sure that there's not a bunch of slop. So I'll just slide this back into place. I don't have any grease on there or anything. And I'll put one pin in just that groove for now. I'm just trying to move it around and make sure there's not excessive play in there. It is normal for there to be room for this to wiggle around. And I also want to make sure I don't feel it hanging up anywhere throughout the travel. Just for comparison, what you can do is take the pin out of there, move to one of the unmodified paths, and then put the pin in that, and see how much play you've got there. You can see pretty much the same deal there. And there's definitely not a lot of wear on there that would affect that, so I've got what I would consider a normal amount of play in the modified path. So at that rate, I'm going to go ahead and continue on. I'll take this back apart, and I'm going to work over all of the remaining 3 paths in the same way. Now I'm ready to put these back together, so I'm going to start by applying assembly lube. This is Bel-Ray assembly lube, as Yamaha specifies. First, you'll notice that there's a little bit of an indented area right here around the center of this shaft on the fixed half, and also these indentations around these holes. So I smear a little bit of assembly lube right around there. And then if you look inside of the torque driver, you should see a recessed area kind of in the center of that. So again, in there, I apply assembly lube. This time, I'm not so sparing with it. I do try to get a good amount of assembly lube inside of there. And then I'll just smear a small amount right around each one of the seals inside of the torque driver on the inside of that lip. Anything that I get outside of there, I do try to wipe off. Then you can slide the torque driver down over top of the fixed half. It may be a little stubborn as this seal is trying to get past the top the fixed half there. There it goes. I just forgot to turn the camera on while I installed the pins, so I just popped one out of there. All you've got to do is rotate this around until the grooves align with the holes in the fixed half, and then you can pop all 4 pins in. Once all the pins are in, I try to stuff some grease into those grooves. And I don't need it tightly packed or anything. I just want to make sure that there is a chunk of grease in every one of the grooves. When you do this, you don't want to leave a whole lot hanging over outside of there, because it's just going to get skimmed off and make a mess when you go to install a cover. And now I'm just going to smear a little bit of grease around the grooved area in the center of this. You can smear it up and down all between the two seals if you'd like, but I try to just mostly get it in the center because it's going to spread out anyway. And then just lightly go over the area where the seals are so they have a thin coating of grease on them. And then I like to wipe over the area above the top O-ring. I don't have to get it all off of there, but I want to get the worst of it off. And I also try to clean up the base where this cup is going to try to seal against this. As I said, I don't like to use brake parts cleaner anywhere that there's going to be contact with a belt, but I have sprayed one of these small brushes and I'm just wiping it around there. That way it completely gets rid of any of the grease left over around that lip on the bottom. I'm also going to wipe off the excess right around the threads. And then I can go ahead and slide this cover back on. Kind of twist it on over top of the O-rings. And make sure it seats all the way down. Now I'm going to wipe everything off that's exposed here, all the grease on this area. And before I go any further, I'm going to work this open and closed a few times, which I can tell you that feels so much more smooth than it did when I first started. That is a drastic improvement. And then I'll go ahead and wipe the excess that usually comes off of this shaft. And I'll open this up. And if you look inside there, you can see a bunch of assembly lube has accumulated at the bottom, and I don't want that in there because that's going to get slung all over the pulleys and cause a bunch of belt slips, so I'm going to clean that out too. Then I'm going to work this thing up and down a few more times and check top and bottom here or center and make sure there's not a bunch of grease. And again, I've got another ring of grease. I'll go ahead and wipe that out. Generally, I just keep doing this until I don't see an accumulation of grease anywhere. Again, it's not something that you want all over your belt or your drive faces. Just to be on the safe side, I put a little bit of alcohol on a rag and I'm going to wipe down my drive faces inside of there so I know I don't have any grease on there. Now I'm going to set my spring down on top of this, seat it inside of there, and make sure it turns freely, it's not binding up there. Which I wanted to note, I don't see any specs for the spring. I'm used to even the small scooters, a lot of times they will tell you a length measurement for the spring to get an idea of the wear on it. I don't see anything like that. I replaced mine at 12,000 miles. I'm so used to small scooters where they fade over time that I just bought one and replaced it then. I didn't see any difference before or after, so I think these things probably last a long time. But if you notice any difference in performance, especially if it seems like RPM is dropping, wouldn't be a bad idea to pick a new torque spring up or Contra spring up before you do your service and just replace it. Now this cap goes on top of the spring. I moved to the floor for a minute because, as you saw when I removed the spring, my all thread is cut a little shorter than it should be for my compressor setup. So I'm going to have to compress the spring a bit to get it started through my cap. Make sure you put the spring nut or the what would normally be the clutch nut on smaller scooters with a clutch there. Put that on. Then put the cap to your compressor on there around that nut. Get your washers and the nut handy. You can look down from the top and kind of align the hole in the top with the all thread. And then get your feet up there on the edges. At least that's what I find easiest. And push that down through there. And then you can install everything else and get the nut started. Now just got to crank this down until I can get that nut inside of there started onto the rear pulley. Pretty snug. Sometimes these clutch or spring nuts can be a little tough to start, so what I like to do is usually hold kind of even pressure on two sides and then rotate it backwards. A lot of times that'll sort of flatten it out. You'll feel it drop down, and then rotate it the normal direction to tighten it. Now that that's as tight as I can get it with my fingers, I'm going to go ahead and back this spring compressor tool off. This nut should be tightened to 65 foot-pounds. So I'm going to take the same holder that I used to remove this pulley from the scooter, and I'm going to put those two bolts into the two holes here and here in the back of it. And then I can use that to hold while I torque it. The last step before this goes back onto the scooter is to put some of this Bell Reassembly lube inside of here. Again, you should be able to look in there and you can see that there is kind of a pocket or a recess where you'll need to put a good bit of this assembly lube. And wipe the excess off of the back. I'm getting ready to assemble and grease the Variator, but I wanted to point something out before I do it because I do it a little differently than they tell you to in the manual. So if you look here on the diagram, they show you to apply Bell Reassembly lube to the inside and the outside of the collar or the drive balls. Then when you look a couple of pages back, they tell you on assembling the primary sheave, do not apply the grease inside of the primary sheave. So that's actually opposite of what I do, because I do apply grease inside of the drive balls or the collar, but I don't apply it outside. Instead of applying it outside of there, I actually do put it in those grooves or that recess inside of the Variator. So that seems to go against what they're telling you there. However, that's how I've done it every single time I've had this apart to swap out rollers or sliders. And so far, everything's been working great. You saw it when I came apart, and I don't have grease everywhere, and I don't have a bunch of wear, so it seems to work, and that's how I'm going to do it. And then I can slide this through there. You can see regardless of what you do, you're going to make a little bit of mess and have to do a little cleanup. Clean the seal, clean the outside of that, flip it back over, and I want to make sure that this seal is clean as well. That's the whole idea. We want to contain the grease within those seals, so we want it to lubricate the drive balls and the Variator when they slide against each other or within, whatever, but we don't want it outside being slung all over the belt or anything else. Now I'm going to install the weights, and in my case I'm using sliders. So sliders, you have to pay close attention when you put those in there. If you look at the side profile, you'll see this flat portion. That is the top of it, and this is the section that goes toward the inside. So you're going to lay it in just like this. And even more complicated if you have two different weights like I do. I'm using 15 and 17 gram both. You have to stagger those. So I put a 15 here, and now I'll put a 17 there.
And then I have to find a 15, put that here, and then a 17 beside that, and a 15, 17, I think you got the idea by now, another 15, the last one will be another 17 obviously.
If you're using rollers, it's really simple. They're shaped like a cylinder, so basically you're just going to put them in the way that would allow them to roll up and down these ramp plates. And then just double check if you're staggering.
15, 17, 15, 17, 15, 17, 15, 17.
Then you want to make sure that's correct and everything is facing the proper orientation if you're using sliders especially, but same deal with rollers. Then I want to install the ramp plate, but before I do, I've got to put these bushings on here, or guides, as I often call them. The manual calls these sliders. There's two different sides of these, but what you'll find is you can't really install them the wrong way because they don't fit. So they fit that way. If I go over here and try to install this way, the way it's made, you just can't get it in there. So that makes it pretty simple. Before this is installed, you have to look around the Variator, and here you'll see I've got a yellow dot on the Variator. That was there from the factory. And you'll notice that there's also a yellow dot on my ramp plate. So that tells me that I want those two yellow dots to align with each other. And it's not a perfect alignment here, obviously. The dot's here and here, but you know that that dot is right next to this post. Now I'm just going to push my thumbs into the center section of the ramp plate, and my fingers are pushing up on the Variator, kind of squeezing them together. And it will probably stay there just from friction. And that's how it's ready to go to transport over to the scooter. You always want to hold this plate into the Variator, otherwise rollers or sliders can be misplaced. That would not be a good thing because you're going to end up taking it all back apart. It's not going to perform well and you could damage things. So always when you're carrying this around, try to squeeze it with your thumbs on the ramp plate and the rest of your fingers on the front. Before I go to install the Variator and the belt and such, I want to have everything ready. So I've already got this spacer cleaned up for the most part, but I'm going to go ahead and remove both of the old O-rings. And then I can install new O-rings. Now I'm finally ready to start putting everything back onto the engine. I'm going to start with the fixed half of the front pulley. That's just going to slide on. You'll have to rotate it a little bit so the splines can align, and then push it all the way back. Before I can install the rear pulley, I need to get it spread apart so that I can actually fit the belt between the halves of the pulley. So this is not like a small scooter where you're going to put it on there and just squeeze it and fight that Contra spring while you get the belt in place. It just ain't going to happen. First off, this is facing the wrong way to make it easy, and second off, there's just a lot of pressure on here. Luckily, Yamaha has an easy solution for us. So you can see you've got two holes in the back of the pulley where your holder goes, but you've also got two holes where you can see some threads through there. And if you've got bolts that are at least 1 3/4 inches long, M6 by 1.0 thread, what you can do is thread one into each one of those holes, and then as you thread these in, they will start pushing apart the rear pulley. And when you thread these in, what I like to do is just kind of work back and forth between the two bolts. Before we do anything with the belt, we want to check it out and make sure it is clean. So you should have already inspected it and made sure that it is okay to install, but if it's a used belt, you definitely want to take it in and just wash it with dish soap and water. Then let that thoroughly dry. If it's a new belt, some people like to do that. I'm not going to do it with this one, but it feels totally clean. If I felt anything oily or any signs of residue, if it just didn't come out of a sealed bag, then I would go ahead and wash it with soap and water and let that dry. We also need to be aware that there are directional arrows on these belts. You can see arrows facing one direction here. So what we want to do when we install the belt is make sure that these arrows face the direction of travel, or they're going with the direction of travel. Basically, in this case, everything's going to rotate around this way, so if the arrows are up top, we want them to face forward. If the arrows were down bottom, we were looking at it from the bottom, they would be facing backwards. But most of us are going to look at this from the top, so the arrows should face forward. So now I'm going to grab the rear pulley, and I'm going to set the belt inside of that pulley, again making sure I know that my arrows are facing the proper direction. I'm just going to kind of pull that into the rear pulley the best I can, and then I'm going to slide my rear pulley onto this shaft. Now remember, there's a marking on the rear pulley that I made earlier, and there's also a marking on this shaft that I made earlier, and those two need to align when I slide this on. So the easy way for me is to align this mark, or rotate this so that this mark faces straight up, and then I will install my pulley with this mark facing straight up, and they should be aligned. slide that on, and you may have to wiggle it a little bit to get it aligned with the splines in the back. There it goes. Okay. Looking at it straight on, you can see that those two marks are aligned. They look a little off because I didn't exactly get them totally straight before, but that's correct for how they were. Now before this nut goes on, they want you to grease the base, back of the nut, and the threads. And you don't need a ton of that. Just try to get a light coating on there. Let me go ahead and start that. And I'll wipe the excess off that I got everywhere else. Now I need to torque this nut to 65 foot-pounds. So I'm going to need my holder again. Again, it's the side with the two prongs. And you may have to rotate this pulley to get it where you need it. Put those in there. And then I'm going to rotate this until my holder is resting against the ground on this side. Then it's easy to take my torque wrench and tighten this to spec. Now it's time for the Variator assembly. So you can see I've got the collar in there, the Variator, the ramp plate, all the weights are in there. So what I'm going to do is start to slide this on. Once I get it on a little bit, I'm going to pick up the belt because I don't want that getting in the way when I'm trying to slide this on. And I'm going to continue to push this on into place all the way until I can get the splines on the back of here over the splines on the crankshaft. There it goes. Now it's locked in and I can't turn it without turning the entire crankshaft. And I want to make sure that all this stuff is squeezed tight. If you have any doubt that maybe any of your rollers in there got loose or rolling around freely, could be out of place, then you want to take this back apart and redo this process. What I'm going to do for now is clean up any of the excess grease that I just got on here. If everything's correct, what you should see is that when you press this in so it's totally seated and it's not resting against the belt or anything, is that the splines that are on that shaft are just slightly recessed behind the outside of this ramp plate, or they're calling it a cam in the manual. If that is off, if those splines are sticking out, you're going to have problems. Nothing's going to get all the way tightened down. With a stock setup, you shouldn't have that issue. I've never used an aftermarket Variator on here for the TMAX, but I've done it a lot on smaller scooters, and I know if anything gets wrong with the spacing, that can be an issue. So definitely be aware of that. Next, I'm going to install this collar. Before I do, that should be greased. They say to use Shell BT grease. I'm just using Bel-Ray waterproof grease. I would also substitute my favorite regular wheel bearing and all-purpose grease like I tend to use on most other things, Mobil 1 synthetic grease. But with this, I'm going to take a little brush. By the way, these little brushes are really handy. I buy them online on Amazon, and you can get a bunch of them really cheap and just keep them around. Just make sure you don't mix them. Don't use a brush that you're using for one grease with anything else. Anyway, I am putting grease inside of there, and I'm also going to put grease. These flies are crazy today. I'm also going to put grease around the outside on the O-rings. Then I can just slide that on. Yamaha also says to apply grease to the base and the threads of this nut. So you can actually grab some of the excess here and use that for that. And then I can start this. With clean hands, I don't have any grease. I am just making sure that the belt is free in both pulleys right now. And then I'm going to continue to get that as tight as I can by hand. I'm going to wipe off just the very back edge to make sure I didn't get any grease there. The front part between those two seals, or from that seal out, should be fine because that's going to be inside of the case riding in a bearing. Now I need to torque this nut. Again, I'm going to use my holding tool. I'm going to use the side with the 4 prongs. I'm going to rotate until this is up against the ground. Then I can take my torque wrench set to 115 foot-pounds and torque this to spec. Now I need to remove both of these bolts, that way the rear pulley can close. Now you can see it's trying to grab the belt. But I'm just going to rotate this around a little bit, get it to kind of seat where it wants to seat. You don't really have to. That took up most of the slack in the belt. I've cleaned it up and I've checked the bearings and the seal looks good on the CVT cover. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall this. And just like when I took it off, if you don't remove the exhaust, it does take a little bit of work to try and get it around there. I just cleaned the CVT filter that goes here on the 12,000 mile service, so this time around I'm going to replace it. That's as far as I can get on the CVT for now. I can't put the front cover on because I need access to this crankshaft bolt. And I've got a replacement for the CVT filter on this side. It goes right there. But I think if I put that on, it may be in the way for other things I'm going to do later. That about wraps it up for the CVT service. So I hope you've enjoyed the video and maybe you've learned something along the way. If you have, please be sure to give this video a like. Share it if you know someone else that could benefit from what's in this video. And don't forget to subscribe for more and click the bell to receive notifications. As always, thank you for watching.